Well, welcome students to the very last lecture for the class, and here we are, part 3 of Gender and War in India's Northeast. So we last left our continuing story with the state of Assam, one of the seven sisters, and Assam existed before the partition of India at independence, but it got split at partition. So the mostly Muslim area joined East Pakistan, which later became the independent state of Bangladesh, and the rest of Assam remained with India. So after partition, the residents of Assam, who were overwhelmingly Hindu, drove out well over 1 million Muslims. Of these Muslims, many returned, some were deported, but basically since 1947-48, the status of the Muslim minority has been a thorny, contentious, and sometimes violent issue in Assam. So in terms of political geography, Assam used to be quite a bit bigger even before that part went off to join East Pakistan. So it used to include 4 other states that are now independent states in the Northwest. So it is significantly smaller than it used to be. All right, so in terms of peoples, I haven't talked too much about economics in these lectures, but one thing I should note here is that it's an especially poor state. Over a third of the population live below the poverty line. And it is, in fact, the poorest of the 7 sisters of the Northeast. So it is very multi-ethnic, about 80 ethnic groups, of which 20 are tribal. And even though there are a lot of them, the scheduled tribes are only about 2.5% of the total population. The largest ethnic group are the Assamese, and they are overwhelmingly Hindu. I think some have converted to Christianity, but they're mostly Hindu. And their ancestors migrated to this region in the 13th century. So the second largest ethnic group would be Bengalis, and some of them are Hindu, some of them are Muslim, and the Hindus being the larger population. So the Hindu Bengali speakers in Assam are primarily those who fled East Pakistan, then Bangladesh, when it became a Muslim country, right? And then because of persecution of Hindus there. So the latter, the Muslim Bengali speakers, are primarily people or the descendants of people who left Bangladesh for economic opportunities. So in Assam, there have been insurgencies waged by at least 3 of the ethnic groups, the scheduled tribes. So the latter, the Bodo, is the biggest of the ethnic, of the indigenous groups here. And just like with the Naga, Bodo is actually sort of an umbrella category, and there's not complete agreement on who is and who isn't a Bodo, and there are a bunch of different subgroups within the Bodo. So approximately 1/5 of the population of Assam are the T tribes, right? These are the self-proclaimed Adivasis, and they are the descendants of those primarily indigenous people who during British colonialism were marched on up there to work on the tea plantations. They usually live in abject poverty. As you can see here, there are about 100 different subgroups. And they have, since 1969, demanded that they be included among the scheduled tribes, right, which would give them reserved seats in politics and in education. However, the state has denied them scheduled tribe status on the grounds that the T tribes lack a shared language and a common territory. So many of the other groups in Assam believe that the T tribes' claim to scheduled tribe status is illegitimate. Okay, moving on to women in war. So there have been several different strains of conflict in Assam that I'm going to go through here. But basically, a lot of it has to do with Assamese nationalism. And the Assamese are, there may be a slight majority in the country, but just slight, right? So basically, they feel like their state has been invaded by others, right? And so in post-colonial India, they advocated a single language, Assamese. So this disadvantaged Bengalis as well as some of the indigenous peoples, and these in turn raised demands for autonomy in order to ensure their cultural survival. So when I'm discussing Assam, and also as you'll see Manipur to some extent, in these states it can be difficult to distinguish between political and criminal violence because there's a lot of both. I can't always tell. And so there's a lot of trafficking in drugs and women through this area. And as an example here, I've got a picture from a newspaper story in which the journalists and the police could not figure out whether these criminals were terrorists or whether they were simply criminals. Okay, so the first conflict that I'm looking at here is the anti-foreigner movement in Assam. And the Assamese have feared being a minority in Assam. So for political reasons, there was not a census taken in 1981 in Assam. I think people knew it was going to be a tinderbox, that the Assamese were going to get upset if they didn't feel like there were enough of them. So it was evident, even without the census, that there was an abnormal growth rate in the population, right? So particularly the Bengali Muslim, but the Bengalis in general were simply reproducing faster than rabbits, right? So the Bengalis and Assamese scholars disagree as to exactly how high this growth rate was, and it was clearly an influx of immigration, right? Because they could not be churning them out, popping the babies out that fast. But whether these immigrants were actually foreigners or whether they were simply people who were from elsewhere in India, we don't know. So hostility toward primarily the Bengalese-speaking immigrants has resulted in much bloodshed, most notoriously the Nellie massacre back in 1983. Nellie was one of the villages in Assam where these massacres took place. And it's hard to find pictures. Most of the pictures are of bloated and chopped up corpses, so I've spared you most of those, but bear with me if the illustrations here are not especially clear. So the reason the Nellie massacre happened was that Assamese non-Muslims, so mostly the Hindus, they were about to have an election, and the Assamese non-Muslims called for a general strike and an election boycott because they said that the voter rolls were full of foreigners, right, meaning the Bengalis. They said it was full of illegal immigrants. So only the Plains Tribal Council of Assam and then the various far-left parties actually participated in the elections. But there were calls that anybody who had joined in the elections should be boycotted, etc. So for several years before this, the RSS and then the proto-BJP, and so these are basically the Hindu power or Hindu extremists, had been covertly fanning the flames of anti-Bengal Muslim sentiment. And remember, the Bengalis here are both Hindu and Muslim, but basically, they were tapping into the idea that India was for the Hindu to try to scapegoat the Bengalese Muslims. So they opposed the Bengalese Muslims not just on religious grounds, but also on political grounds. They were claiming that they tended to be communist. Right, so of course, 1980s, this is the Cold War. So there was a massacre, after the elections took place, there was a massacre. The exact death toll is not known, but more recent things I've seen have said over 2,000. Victims being primarily Muslims of East Bengali origin. Women and kids were 80% of the dead, and kids including babies. So we don't know why women and kids were primarily the victims. We don't know if it's simply that the men were able to run away. Maybe the men had left to try to go stage an attack somewhere else. Or possibly the attackers were attempting to prevent another generation from being born by destroying the wombs and the upcoming generation. I don't know. But what we do know is that nobody has ever been convicted for all these murders. So the killers were some of the Hindus, but mostly tribals in Assam. And these are the various tribal groups that were involved. And a lot of the killings were particularly gruesome. I'll spare you details. So similar episodes took place in these years. And in every case, violence was especially brutal, and women tended to get the worst of it. Right. And most of it was directed against Bengali-speaking Muslims, although not exclusively. So in 2019, as in last year, Assam used the NRC, the National Register of Citizens, to disenfranchise some 2 million people, mostly Muslims, and they had the power of the central government behind them, because remember, the central government at this time is dominated by the Hindu extremists, right? So the National Register of Citizenship shows who was in India before 1971. 1971 is important because that's the year that Bangladesh fought its War of Independence, which caused huge numbers of Bengalis to stream into India. Right, so these people and their descendants are primarily the ones who are being called foreigners or illegal immigrants here. So these 2 to 4 million people in Assam, not only can they no longer vote, but they are now stateless. And basically what they're saying is, if you can't prove that you or your ancestors were on this list of, 1970 list, then you're not an Indian citizen, you're stateless. And what we've found is that this is particularly disenfranchised the poor and women. A lot of people have found themselves disenfranchised simply because of clerical error, because there are variations in the spelling of a name, right? In many cases, people weren't issued birth certificates, et cetera, et cetera. So it's been a mess, and it's been a catastrophe. However, the result was that not only were they going to be kicking out the Muslims, but they were going to be kicking out the Bengalese Hindu as well. Right? And a lot of them had fled in 1971 or in waves thereafter when things didn't get too nice for Hindus over in East Pakistan, then Bangladesh. So the Hindu power government central government said, uh-oh, what can we do? And in 2019, they issued the federal CAA, Citizenship Amendment Act. And this piece of legislation, and I can't imagine that the Supreme Court is going to let this stand, but in any case, this piece of legislation says that migrants from neighboring countries to India can get citizenship in India in as little as 6 years, as long as they aren't Muslim. Right, so the express intent of this law at the federal level was to enfranchise those Hindu Bengali speakers in Assam who had gotten disenfranchised in August. However, the Assamese, for the most part, are not happy about this. They think that to save Assam, you should get rid of all of the Bengalis, regardless of whether they're Hindu or Muslim. All right, so they want the Hindus out as well. Okay, so that was the anti-foreigner movement. Then the Assamese secessionists, they want Assam to be its own independent country. And the earliest and main group associated with them is ULFA, the United Liberation Front of Assam, which formed in April of 1979, and it's discussed in the Saxena reading. And she notes, of course, that recently it had split into pro and anti-Tox factions, right? So some of them are willing to make nice with India. I think that they're probably going to try to get some self-determination for Assam within the greater Federation of India. So there is not a single ethnic identity to Alpha, but the various peoples are united by their goal of an independent Assam. And the state has used sexual violence against women as one tactic of its counterinsurgency campaign, both for these various ethnic and the Alpha insurrections. Okay, third, tribal fighting and infighting. And remember, I'd mentioned that the Adivazis have been trying to get scheduled tribe status, right? The Adivazis here being the T tribes, right? So they've been the target of much violence. The Bodoland nationalists, there are a variety of different flavors of them, but they won in 2003 Bodoland territorial districts in North Assam. So again, think kind of like Native American reservations, right? So they have their own little political councils here. And in these political councils, they have reserved for themselves 3/4 of the seats. However, even in these political entities that bear their name, the Bodo comprise only approximately 1/3 of the residents, right? So they are the Bodo are a significant minority in Bodoland, ironically enough. So, ironically and tragically, these new territories, which were intended to create peace by giving the Bodo some autonomy, have actually created new battlegrounds because the other 2/3 of the population who live in Bodoland feel like they are dominated by the Bodo minority. Okay, moving on to the state of Manipur. It was an ancient kingdom that came under indirect rule by the British in the late 19th century. It thought that it was going to become its own independent country in 1947. It thought it was going to be a constitutional monarchy with an elected legislature. However, the king, who was allegedly under duress, signed a merger agreement with India. So at that time, Manipur became a union territory within India, directly ruled by Delhi. But indigenous grievances grew, and Manipur became an independent Indian state in early 1972. However, things did not settle down, and of all of the Seven Sisters states, this one has seen the most and the worst violence. So in terms of political geography, you can see Manipur over here by the Burma or Myanmar border, whatever you want to call it there. And as in Assam, often it's hard to distinguish between political and criminal violence here. Again, it being a border territory, there is a lot of traffic of drugs and women, probably guns as well. Okay, so in terms of peoples, religiously speaking, Hindus and Christians each are about 40% of the population, and then Muslims there who have resided there for a while, you know, their ancestors have been there for some time, they comprise about 8.4% of the population. So the Meitei is the dominant ethnic group. They comprise more than half of Manipur. And here you can see that some of them are demonstrating to be a scheduled tribe, which really doesn't make sense because the scheduled tribes are to be the discriminated against minorities, right? Scheduled tribes vary from state to state, and so the idea that the dominant tribe would be a scheduled tribe in its own state seems a little odd, but whatever. So they're usually Hindus. They don't have scheduled tribe status, and what this means is that they cannot own land in the hill districts. Only the scheduled tribes can own land in the hill districts. So the Maitai took to the valleys, became farmers, and for the most part have become more prosperous than the various hill tribes. There are about 33 scheduled tribes. They comprise about 35% of Manipur. The Naga and the Kuki are the main groups of scheduled tribes. Again, these are kind of amorphous categories which contain many groups within them. And they are usually Christians, and they usually live in the hills, although they can live wherever they want to in the state. Moving on to women in war in Manipur. The big problem here in Manipur is that there are several diaspora peoples who claim some of Manipur for their own homeland. And I just chose the Kuki here, but I could have done this with all three groups and probably more groups than just this. So the Kukis say that sovereignty is our historical right. They've taken up arms for this, and here's their proposed map of Kuki state. So you can see that they want this circle, they want basically all of Manipur except the center. So they want to turn it into a donut, basically. And so the central government keeps saying, no, you can't split up Manipur, no, you can't split up Manipur, no, you can't do that. But each of these groups wants to create a greater Nagaland or Kuki land or whatever. And so the fighting continues. All right, UNLF is discussed in your readings to some degree. The Mighty Eyes founded it in 1964 as a socialist, secessionist, armed insurgency. And it shows up in the book I assigned. At one point, they rescue Purnima. You may or may not remember that. So women have been involved in the various insurgent groups in Manipur since the 1980s, but usually they were not combat fighters. So one thing I've found interesting is that these groups have a strong policy against sexual violence. And you can see here, I'm not going to try to pronounce that K word, but the K Communist Party set up its own anti-rape squad, about 8 years ago. And they said that they were going to hunt down rapists in order to administer more severe justice than Indian law, because Indian law actually very seldom would prosecute the rapists, much less convict them. So ULFA has seized on this, and it's a nuisance when I'm trying to do research on sexual violence by the state in Manipur, because when I pull up newspaper articles, it's usually about these various groups murdering somebody who's been accused of rape. And, not necessarily a state agent. They particularly go after school teachers who do things school teachers shouldn't. Okay, so rape has been a counterinsurgency strategy against the various insurgent groups, and this is the grave of a young Naga woman who some generations ago was gang raped and killed herself. She was a poet, and so her death got a lot of attention. But here's a more recent example. And in Manipur, the levels of violence the last year have been significantly lower. There have been peace talks. Some people have signed peace accords, but unfortunately, there's been no peace accord that involves all the various fighting parties. So while the conflict has diminished a little bit, it by no means has gone away. And there are at this moment literally thousands of militants from Manipur who are over the border in Myanmar. Okay, so moving on to conclusions. Just to wrap this up here, I have used India throughout this course as the focus area, right? We've looked at culture, we've looked at electoral politics, now we've looked at conflict. And in terms of your discussion question, your very last discussion question, I liked what you came up with for the previous set. So one of your options is to come up with a question of your choice again, but then here are two other options that you might write about if you are stumped for a question of your own choice. So thanks very much,